April 6, 1979. Arden and Helen McAllister of Medina, New York are interviewing Mr. E. Earl Harding of Five Corners, which is in Orleans County, 1 mile north of Albion, New York. We are interviewing Mr. Harding at his home.
Born in 1895 in the house where I now live. This house is on the farm that was taken from my paternal grandparents. They bought it from the Holland Land Company in 1820. My father's name was Elias James Harding. My mother, Gertrude Ross Harding. They both lived in the town of Gaines. Mother's father and brother ran the store at Childs. When they were married in the room above the store. Dad lived over near Gaines. His father was a farmer and school teacher. I went to school at the Five Corners School, which is rather carrying across the road from our house. At that time, because it was so close to home, I had to come home to dinner. And that was a great cross, because Mother would make me stay home and eat a proper dinner, and I couldn't get back to play cards, play baseball with the children as quickly as I would like to. Some of the school was, I say, across the road. Right back of the school was a large pile of logs where we played, and those logs were there because over on the other road was a large sawmill and foundry, and where they made fancy furniture. That foundry is still gone, and it was located right north of the office building that is now on the triangle. Across, also bordering our farm, was a cemetery. That was also a good place to play, and a good place to shoot woodchucks. I remember one time we had a group of young people here at the house, and we were discussing ghosts and like that because it was near the cemetery, and so we all dared one another to go down to the cemetery. Well, unbeknownst to us, Dad heard our conversation. He grabbed a sheet and went down back way to meet us. Well, when we met him there, we left the cemetery rather quickly, came home.
Do you, Mr. Harding, do you remember, you said something about someone carrying a coffin down to the cemetery?
Yeah. One of the things that I remember very vividly about the cemetery was the death of my uncle who lived next door. He was about, 600, 700 feet from the cemetery, the house was. I went to the funeral. I was very small. The casket was put in a hearse, drawn by horses, and it was a good summer day. We all walked up to the cemetery behind the hearse. I remember that impressed me very much. He was, as far as I can remember, the very last person buried at that cemetery. Also, one thing that impressed me very much in that house, they had a room where they had taken off the nameplates of the caskets, and they were framed and hung up on the wall. Well, that room was so spooky that I was kind of afraid to go in it. Also at school, I guess I told about the water bucket, didn't I?
No, you haven't talked about the water bucket.
Well, one of the big do's at the school, when the school got their water from a house next door where they had a large flock of turkeys. Two of the larger boys were delegated, which was quite an honor, to go get the water, which was gotten in a pail. And one boy with a broom was delegated to go along and keep the tom turkey away. At the school, the water bucket was set on a bench, and we all went up when we needed a drink and got our water out of the same pitcher or same dipper. Also at that school, at one time, I was the janitor. I got 50 cents a week for my work and was doing very well until one day the door of the stove blew open. And I went home and got Dad because I didn't know what I had done. But after that, Mother would not let me be janitor anymore. Of course, one of the big do's at school was baseball. No inside plumbing, of course. When you need to go to the bathroom, you raise 2 fingers and out you went.
Do you remember who your teacher was over there?
I can remember several teachers. One was Miss Barnum, one was Roy Bacon. Some of the teachers weren't very strict. I remember in the last part of my school year, some kids, when the teacher wasn't very good, would put a lot of waste papers in under the desk and light them, and then the teacher would come running back with a dipper of water and the fire would be out. Of course, in real cold weather, we all gathered around the big stove that sat in the front of the room that warmed the whole room. I don't know how many grades were there, but we all listened when everybody recited, so we all knew all the grades.
And you had just the one teacher for
Just the one teacher, yes. There was a Miss Wood, I remember. There was a very fine teacher, and was there for quite a while. After district school, at the 7th grade, my family started me in the Albion school, and at that time there were no buses, any way to get there except how your family got you there. Dad rented a stall from a man close to the school, and for a time I rode horseback to school, and later I walked or rode a bicycle.
Excuse me, you say your father rented a stall. You mean a stall, a place to park the horse?
Place to park the horse, yeah. And
would that be what they'd call in a drive barn?
no, I'll come to that later. This is in a private man's barn, rather close to the school. And when I'd go galloping through town on that horse, I really thought I was something. After a while, school buses started coming, started working. They were, at that time, buses drawn by horses, made on a wagon with side curtains on it. The wagon just went around one square near Albion. I remember all the children here at Five Corners gathered together at Mother's house till the bus came, and come in, it was cold weather, and we'd get on that bus and be delivered. One thing I remember, maybe not so good, but one small boy had an electric fit on the bus. I remember carrying him into the school. I was at that time one of the bigger boys riding the bus. Later on, of course, buses were made from trucks, but in those days, if you saw a car, if you heard a car going by, you quickly ran to the road to watch it go by. And it didn't go by fast because our roads were very deep sand, and if you had a car and a tire blew out, well, first, if you got 3,000 miles on a tire, you did very well. And when that tire blew out, you generally had a repair kit with you. You stopped and fixed the tire, and then on you went. And but I say, any kind of a hill, you shifted into second gear or first gear to be able to get up the hill. Our first car that Dad bought was a car that he bought for us to learn to drive with. And it was a combination of 2 different cars put together. Later on, he brought a new car, and as I remember, it was a Cadillac and cost $2,000. And we really thought we were something when we had that. That was a car with a top that you put up and down according to the weather, and Mother was very much against it when we changed to a sedan because she was very sure that they would be top heavy and tip over.
Do you have any recollection of the very first time you saw a car, automobile?
Well, not any vivid recollection of it. I do remember, though, if you saw one coming, you came a-running to watch it go by the house.
Yeah.
The only vivid remembrance I have of a car is when they first started with electric lights. A doctor at Whittier in Albion had a car with electric lights, and they were so much brighter than the others that we kids could identify that car coming down the road.
What kind of lights did they have before?
Well, a gas light. I don't know, it's just in a little tank with your gas on there. tubes to the lights.
Probably most people didn't drive after dark, did they?
Not very much, no.
Nor
no,
in the winter
no.
time.
No, I remember our first trip, long trip, was to Medina, to Jeddo, north of Medina, where Mother had a friend that she had made through the Good Templars. In those days, the Good Templars Lodge was rather the high social point of the year, and that was really some trip. We chugged our way up there and back, and
From Albion to Jeddo.
yeah, ground our way, I guess you would say.
Who'd you visit there? Josiah Payne, was it?
The woman that we were visit was Josiah Payne's wife. Yeah. She was a stepmother of Mr. Payne, who was an attorney in Medina at the time. They had 3 daughters, and so we visited back and forth there. Another one of our childhood friends was as I told you, maybe the family went to Gaines to church, and it was the Burroughs family.
Girls.
Yeah, and he was the minister there at that church, and our families were very close. And I went to college with one of his sons.
Yes. I believe that was Matson Burroughs.
That was Matson.
Yes.
Yeah, Ambrose Matson was the
Ambrose Matson.
was the real name. Yeah,
That's right.
yeah, and well, I say I went to Albion School, graduated in 1915, pardon me. And from there I went on to Cornell, where I spent 3 years. During Cornell, the World War I was on. First, before I went to, well, during the war, I was classified as 4F, because then it was quite thought that they needed help on the farm.
Right.
Well, I came home, was on the farm a little while one year, on my junior year, I believe it was. And I was here for a while, and all my friends were going to camp, and the thing to do was to go to camp. So I went up to the draft board. Most of the boys were drafted those days. I went up to the draft board and told the man, who was Isaac Swartz, to, next time they sent a group to camp, to include my name. So in about a week, I was on my way. And
How did your family feel when they found that you had done this?
well, I don't know whether I told Mother or not before, but I remember it was kind of a sad day, the day that I went, and they weren't very happy about it. But as it turned out, the week that I was drafted, and not, well, I went to the camp, was the week that the Germans started to retreat. Now, whether they knew I was coming or not, I don't know. But that's the way it was.
Where did you go when you went
And
to camp?
really, my experience in camp was really a good vacation for me. I spent 2 months in New York University, while in the Army, studying to be a telegraph operator. And from there I went to Fort Hamilton for a little while, out on the island near New York City, and then to Fortress Monroe, Virginia, where I was in the officers' training camp until the end of the war. And at the end of the war, I was very quickly discharged and was home within a month after the war was over. So I didn't have any experiences that were at all dangerous, and to me as a farm boy, walking and marching and like that was just plain good exercise. And
When you came back, did they have any kind of a celebration for the fellows who returned from the war?
well, not particularly, because as I remember at least, because you had a uniform on, you strutted around, looked like something. But I don't remember whether we had local celebrations or not. I doubt it. I mean, we would be invited out to. When I was in New York City, it was very pleasant. For one thing, that was before uniforms were very common around there. And you could stand on a street corner any Sunday day and with your thumb be invited home to dinner and have a good dinner and delivered back. It was really very pleasant, and there, of course, every week they had dances and like that for the soldiers up there in New York, at New York University. So it was really as I look back on it, a very pleasant experience. And
Uniforms usually catch the eyes of pretty young girls. Is this how you met your wife, or did you
no,
meet her before?
no, no. I got home from the Army, and eventually decided I needed a degree, so I went back to school, completed my work at Cornell, graduated in 1920. The break in coming home and being in the Army set me back 1 year in college. I would have normally graduated in 1919. Then I come home to the farm, worked here for a few years, did quite a lot of looking around, finally met a girl that I thought would make a very good wife, and married Marguerite Hazard, an Albion girl. And in June 7th, we hope to celebrate our 54th wedding anniversary. We have one daughter and 3 grandchildren, of which we are very proud. And after marriage and things
Let me ask you, excuse me, what was your wedding like? Do you remember?
What my wedding like?
Yeah, were you married in a church or up above a store?
We were married in the Episcopal Church in Albion, which was Marguerite's church. And we were married on my mother and father's 30th wedding anniversary. And of course, we had a lot of our good friends around then. Still, about 3 of them are still alive. And see quite a lot of them.
What year was that?
1924.
24.
We were married, yeah. You're separate. And we had a reception at Mrs. Harding's family's house, which our friends came up to, and spent our honeymoon in a cottage down at the lake. So I could be home.
You mean down at what lake?
Lake Ontario. At that time, I was actively farming, and it was right during the spray season. So I had to be available to spray right quick and often.
You had a fast honeymoon then.
In a fast honeymoon. At that time, we had a Model T Ford Coupe, which at that time was quite the thing for the young people around Albion to have. Before we were married, we and several of our friends had rented a cottage at the lake, and that was our headquarters for playing. And at that time, in front of that cottage would be parked a row of Ford Coupes, which was our status in life.
You said that you were actively farming. Then where did you make your home? Did you come in here with your parents?
No, we never. We spent one winter with our parents, and then we had a house about a quarter of a mile up the road, where it was our tenant house, and we fixed that up, and we lived there for 15 years. And I would say it was close enough to walk back and forth. Mother and father passed away in 1940, and at that time they both passed away the same year, and we moved in here and have been here since then. As I say, we were actively farming, and eventually I became active in activities around town and both locally and state. I started out, I guess, being chairman of the Methodist Church Board of Trustees. I was that for quite a few years, and otherwise, other things I did a lot of. I was Secretary-Treasurer of the local Extension Service for about 12 years, one of the first organizers and directors of the local directors and organizers of the Albion GLF Cold Storage Co-op that operates a large cold storage and common storage, did fruit and onion grading, packing equipment, had a cherry packing operation, and sold feed and fertilizer. It was a branch of it was affiliated with the GLF organization. And after that, and along with that, I was active in Farm Bureau work here. I was one of the first committeemen. I was the first president of the local Farm Bureau. And on the local town board of Gaines for 22 years. And during that time, being a member of the town board wasn't as competitive a job as it is now, I guess, because I never at that time asked for one vote. I was appointed to fill a man named Burns' place, and was reelected from that 5 times. And at that time, it wasn't a very highly paying job. As I remember, we got $100 a year. But it was an interesting job. The most interesting job I ever had was being director of the local bank, a branch of the Marine Midland. When you were on the bank board, you knew what was going on in town, generally before it happened, which was a very interesting thing to do.
Now, what were the years that you were on the bank board about? Was that during the time of the Depression, for instance? That would have been very interesting.
I don't remember what it was.
That would have been after the Depression.
Yeah, it was after the Depression.
Yes.
I remember one thing that impressed me a lot on the town board was the number of people where both people were working, husband and wife, and the amount of debts they would have because they would buy all these things on time. I used to think if they would just quit buying for about a week and catch up, what a lot of money they would save, because interest on more things like that made the equipment rather expensive. You spoke about the Depression. One thing that I remember very well of the Depression, at one time we had a farm in the town of Kent. And at that time, during the Depression, I sold that farm and bought a farm closer to home. And both of those farms changed hands for a less price than the buildings were insured for. On either farm, the buildings had burned, the price of the insurance on the buildings was more than paid for the price of the farm. I remember a bit on the farm too. Of course, at that time we were growing most everything we needed to eat, our groceries and like that. We remember had one very good man on the farm that we paid $12 a week in the summer and $10 a week in the winter. And he rented his own house. That's all I remember. Going to the grocery store once, and I told remember telling the grocery man, if I didn't need salt and pepper, we wouldn't bother to come in and see him. And
did you trade off? Some people
yes.
have told us about trading off
Yes,
butter and eggs.
Well, we raised strawberries, and we'd run quite a bill up, and then he'd kind of have to take it out in strawberries if he wanted to get his money. So that was one way of selling berries. And eggs, too. I had quite a lot of chickens and sold eggs. I remember once I had a contract with Sibley's in Rochester, selling eggs for $1 a dozen, which shows that eggs now weren't as high as they had been. Also, one of my activities, I was the first president of the local Farm Bureau, and I was on the state board of the Farm Bureau for 6 years. I was on the board of directors of the Virgil Bogue Home for many years. That was a job that I inherited from my father.
The Virgil Bogue.
The Virgil Bogue Home was a home set up for wayward children, and they would stay there for a few years, and then there are several people around town that are graduates of that home that are doing very well. so I'm quite proud of what we did. We had a very fine woman as a matron, and I remember at that time I was going to the Methodist church, and she would have all of those children in church fill about 2 pews of children from that school. Eventually they would go out and be placed in other homes or get other jobs.
Now, will these children be placed in that home by the social workers or by the...
Quite apt to by the social workers. They weren't particularly disturbed children that had to be watched closely. They were just good children. And I was also president of the president of the State Cherry Growers Association, and later on president of the chairman of the National Cherry Pie Baking Contest, something we did in Chicago every year on Washington's birthday, which is rather natural for a cherry.
Yes.
And I say the year I was president or chairman of it was the 21st year of its existence. And we used to go there to that every year. And
Orleans County still has cherry pie baking contest, don't they?
Yeah. Well, the year I was chairman, I remember we had 50 contestants, one from each state in the Union and other places, which was, in my book, quite a do.
Yes.
I was also president of the State Horticultural Society at one time, chair on the State Advisory Council on Employment and Unemployment that I was appointed to by Governor Rockefeller. And that's also a director on the State Farm Family Insurance Board. And along with being a general joiner, I was a Mason. I joined the Masons when I was in the Army. I was home on furlough, and I was initiated in the Masonic Lodge, getting 3 degrees in one day. They met and in the afternoon and the evening. My uncle, Chester Harding, who lived by Noseville at the time, was very active in the Masonic Temple here in Albion, and he kind of sponsored me and got me through in a hurry. And it did some good when I was in the Army. I remember one time a sergeant there appointed 2 other men as to be on latrine duty, and later told me that he appointed them because he saw I had the proper kind of a ring on.
Oh, kept you out of latrine duty. Never thought of the Masons helping that way. Are you still an active Mason?
Yes,
Yeah.
I've been a Mason now 60 years. Got a 60-year plaque the other day.
Wonderful.
I also belong to the local Lions Club and the Town Club of Albion.
Yes.
I guess that's the most of my joining.
Well, you said at one time you also helped do something working with the migrant camps.
Well,
Or something.
yes. Well, I do have a migrant camp now, but was on the committee had to do with migrants. At one time went to Albany to meet with the Commissioner of Health and problems of the operators of small migrant labor camps. We met to help to initiate a plan to include farmers and a committee to form a potential working out set of regulations for migrant laborers. At that time, migrant laborers were housed in most any kind of a shack, and they were very much put upon and not treated properly, people thought. And Albany was really bearing down on them. I remember Long Waters of Medina was quite sticking up for the farmers, but in the meantime, the do-gooders were giving the farmers the dickens, so he was trying to be the man in between, and they gave him quite a hard time. Long Waters of Medina at that time was a member of the Assembly in Albany, and we went down, 3 of us went to Albany to talk to Lon about migrants and their treatment in labor camps. Because at that time, migrants were not housed as well as they are now, and there was a lot of people that were, we called them do-gooders at the time, complaining that we weren't treating the migrant, that the farm people weren't treating the migrants properly, and Lon was kind of in between trying to protect the farmers and the do-gooders. I remember in Albany, 2 people went with me. One was Charlie Bush off Kendall or Kent Way, who was quite active in writing letters that were rather strong. And I should say, Charlie and I and Lon met with the Commissioner of Agriculture in Albany at the time, Don Wickham, who is one of my very good friends now. And I remember the way Don introduced those 2 to the group there was, he introduced them as Poison Pen Bush and Troubled Waters, and I thought that was pretty good. Kind of.
Well, going back to when you were a very young boy, do you remember any circuses or fairs?
When the circuses came to town, it was really a big do for we kids and people around Albion. The circus, when it came to Albion, was generally set up north of Albion where the present bowling alley is, in that field. And that being fairly close to my home, well, all of us kids, the day of the circus, would get up early in the morning to go up and watch them unload and help what we could.
That was at the railroad property.
Yeah, so they were brought in by railroad, and go up there and watch them unload, walk the elephants down, and everything they did, watch them set up their tents. And if you could get a job carrying water or something, maybe you got to pass into the circus. And then that night they would load, after the circus night, they would load and be on their way the next day. And the next morning, you got up early and went up to the circus grounds and snooped around, because quite apt to be, you'd find a few coins on the ground that people had lost out of their pockets. And that was one way of, well, you just went up and looked around and see what you could find. It kind of prolonged the excitement of the circus. And that isn't, well, of course, the Albion Fair was quite a do. I got a job, I used to work there in the fruit part of it, and that gave me a reason for being there all the time. And eventually I got to have a job at the State Fair. A local resident here in Albion was chairman or in charge of the fruit exhibit in Syracuse. And he would give a job as a helper to a boy in high school that was interested in agriculture. Well, I qualified, so Charles Porter was the man, and he had a very nice daughter too that I used to see some. But he gave me a job working in Syracuse, where we would go for 10 days. I remember the first day of the fair, we would generally work all night, helping set up the exhibit, helping the exhibitors set up their exhibit. And then after that, we'd get there early in the morning, dust off all the exhibits, and just walk around in an important way because you were working there, and maybe answer a few questions. But we stayed, I remember, at the old Yates Hotel, which was right downtown in Syracuse. I guess maybe it still is. At that time, it was, well, a good hotel, and the railroad went right down the street in front of it.
Is that how you would get to the fair? Would you go on the railroad?
Yes, we'd go on the railroad, because you weren't running around in automobiles that days. And so for me, it was a big do and a good vacation.
Yes.
Enjoyed it very much. And it gave you a good chance to see the fair. I remember one time it rained so hard that some pigs when we were setting up some pigs drowned out in the pig sty, and what little sleep we got that night, we slept in automobiles and that were there for exhibition.
The fair has grown considerably since you were a young man, right?
Yes, I imagine it has grown a lot, yeah.
Yes.
In fact, I don't know whether I'm much fair-minded now, because I've been there for quite a few years, but I remember the last time I was there, in a half a day I was ready to come home. So I guess I saw all my fair looking while I was a child.
Do you remember, did they have a midway section
Oh,
when
yes.
you were boy?
Yeah.
Yes.
We'd go down the midway and do things, but
What would be on the midway, for instance?
mostly merry-go-rounds and Ferris wheels. Not quite as scary looking as they do now. But some girly shows. I don't remember too much about that.
The penny arcade where you put a penny in and watch the movies?
I guess it was. Most of my time was be spent there at the horticulture building where I was, and I remember that much more than what I did in the midway. But we'd duck out for a few minutes every once in a while.
What about eating? Did they have eating facilities on the ground, or did you pack lunches from home?
No, we, of course, I was there for 10 days, so I bought my meals there, and
Yes.
probably lived on hot dogs, but I don't know. They were there then.
When you were a young boy, can you remember, you were active in the church, weren't you?
Yes.
And
Yeah, we used to, my family, we all quite good attendance at church. And I remember one thing, Mother and Father would sit where they belonged, and seemed to be some sort of a gathering off one side, some pews were, where all us boys would sit. I remember two things about that. One time the minister stopped in the middle of his sermon and looked over our way and said, "I'll expect great things from those people over there." We were whispering too much. Another thing I remember very much, one of my friends had a job pumping the organ, and he invited me back there to see how it worked. Well, they had a long stick that you pushed up and down to pump the organ. It kept the bellows full of air, and he let me do that. Well, I didn't know enough about it to keep it, pump it fast enough. Maybe I got talking to him, I don't know. But anyway, I let the bellows run out of air, and the organist was not very pleased. All at once, she couldn't play the organ. That was after we started Albion Church later, when we were very young, because Dad and Mother were both from the town of Gaines. We went there to church.
but the bellows business was in the Albion Church?
The Albion Church was the bellows business, yeah.
Uh-huh.
I remember Teed Woods, a very good friend of mine for years, had the job pumping the organ. He was the son of Woods and Sprague, who had the mill in Albion.
You remember Saturday nights were so popular when we were
Yes,
younger.
when I was very young. Saturday night was the big social event in Albion. All the families would go to Albion to do their shopping, and probably the main thing I remember in Landor's store there used to be stools in front of the counter, and they would be up to the door. Well, the one thing I remember most about that was the stool by the door. In the summer, the store doors would be open, and on that stool would most always be the very same rather fleshy woman sitting on that stool watching everybody go by. Another thing I remember about church is the Sunday school picnics that we had down at Lake Ontario. We would load up the surrey, Dad would, and all us kids in our lunch get in the surrey and go down to the lake to the Sunday school picnic. Well, we wouldn't get there an awful lot before time to eat, and after eating, maybe we'd get a swim and a little time to play, and it was time to start for home. Because you didn't do that very quickly. Dad had a team on the Surrey that pulled us along pretty good, but
That would take you probably more than an hour to get
oh
there.
yes, yeah, hour and a half anyway, and but it was still a big day. And I think it was a Surrey with a fringe on the top.
You probably went up to Point Breeze?
Yes.
There.
On the point on the west side, I think that was the Point Breeze side. No, Oak Orchard side. That would be the Oak Orchard side. And at that time, there was a big hotel there on the west side, and along the front of the lake was a row of bathhouses where you could go in, change your clothes, go swimming. It was a huge hotel with a big veranda around it, both upstairs and downstairs veranda.
Do you remember, did you know Charlie Howard, the Santa Claus?
Charlie Howard, Santa Claus, was one of my main buddies when I was a kid. And we went to school together. In fact, his mother and father and my mother and father were very good friends and used to go back and forth for dinners and like that. And Charlie and I went to Albion High School together. Charlie at that time was very active in putting on plays and like that. And we both carried our dinners to school. And during the noon hour, after dinner, Charlie and I would kind of put on semi-entertainments for the kids there.
Oh, such as what?
Oh, whatever we could do. It was darn foolish.
Was it singing or dancing or just poetry or jokes?
Mostly horsing around and jokes. Or I would be the straight man for Charlie because he was, at that time, as I say, very active in show work. Later on, Charlie did put on shows around town and around the country, and I was in a lot of shows with him and for him. And later he became very famous as the, well, really nationally wide famous as the local Santa Claus.
Right.
He had a business of manufacturing Santa Claus outfits that he sold. He also ran a Santa Claus school, both of which are still in existence, I believe. There's a woman in Albion, I'm just reading in the paper today, I believe, Mrs. Babcock, I think, telling about her business in having the business Santa Claus outfits, cleaning them and manufacturing them. And the Santa Claus school is now run by a man, I believe, out in Michigan. Charlie, as I said, was a very famous Santa Claus at one time. He was Santa Claus in the famous, was it Neiman Marcus store?
The Macy's Parade, Macy's Thanksgiving.
He was there in the Macy's Parade,
Yes.
and was also Santa Claus in Macy's store, I believe.
Yes.
And also Santa Claus in Neiman Marcus in Mexico.
Oh, is that right?
Texas.
I see.
Yeah, that is a
yes.
huge store in Texas.
Yes,
But Charlie was down there once. He also, in his very early years, he was quite a man to get around doing things. He and Ruth, his wife, manufactured the best ice cream you could get anywhere around. When you wanted ice cream, you would go up to Charlie Howard's and get his ice cream. You really had something. And later on, he had a business of combining wheat around the country. Combining wheat also brings up more memories. Before the days of the combine, my father was one of the first ones to have a self-binder for cutting grain around here. And he would cut grain for some of his local neighbors. And with a binder, you cut the grain. It was bound into what we call sheaves, set into shocks till it dried out, drawn up and stored in the barn till the local thresher could come around. Just put his thresh machine on the barn floor. If it was in the barn, sometimes it was stacked and threshed in the field, and threshed that way with a threshing machine that had a large steam engine along to run it. Before the thresher would come, we'd get ready, have some soft coal for him to burn, Mother would cook up a big meal because all the neighbors would come in to help you thrash, and they would come in the house to dinner, and it was quite a do. The farmers would change works in thrashing.
Help each other.
Help each other, yeah.
Yes.
So you didn't spend a lot of money
Yes.
doing it, but that was the way the grain was.
Farming has changed so much, hasn't it?
Yes.
Now mostly big farms and
Yeah.
very few small farmers.
At that time, we, of course, we were doing it with horses. Remember the first tractor Dad got was a Ford tractor with steel wheels.
Yes.
And sometimes in the morning, getting that tractor started, it didn't start with a battery, you cranked it. And by the time you got that tractor going, you'd done a day's work. Well, those days we had I think the farm was just 100 acres. Later on, when I bought another farm up the West Bacon Road that had 120 acres, which increased my farming some. And then I rented the Larwood farm, which was across the road on another corner. So I finally built up that I had 400 acres that I was farming. A lot of fruit. We rose a lot of tomatoes. It was a lot to us then, 25 acres, which was marketed locally. At that time in Albion, there was at least 3 factories where you could sell tomatoes. You could sell them at Lipton's. General Foods had a factory that finally became Hunt's, and Friends all took tomatoes, and some drawed at the Berry Center where a man, Wallace Dale, had a factory for tomatoes. And at that time also, there was 3 cold storages in Albion where you could store your apples. Now, I don't think any one of those 3 storages will store apples at all. 2 of them are, well, they're warehouses, but they have no apple storage. One is built as storage for sharp freeze foods, but there are no apple storages in Albion.
Is that because the apples require a certain humidity or what?
Well, those storages were refrigerated storages. They required refrigeration. There was also the common storage, but that didn't keep the apples only a short period of time.
You had a rather unique, what was it, a watering system? Hydraulic?
Yes, that was one of a kind around here. I don't know whether you know what a hydraulic ram is, but a hydraulic ram is set up so a stream of water runs down a pipe, goes through a valve, and it finally flips shut with the force of the water, forcing some water up into an air chamber. And when the flow stops, the pressure drops down, the valve opens, and the water from the air chamber has been forced up into a storage tank. That's a hydraulic ram. It pumps. There are all kinds. Some at that time were big enough to supply cities. But the one we had would maybe pump, 3,000–4,000 gallons a day. But it was enough for our use on the farm. And we had a pond on the farm that raised the water level up enough to give the force to run this ram. And then from the ram it was piped to the barn. I think at that time there was also one ram in the county down by the Lindenville ponds. But that ram would go thump, thump, thump. 24 hours a day. It needed no other power to run it than that. No grease to be used. It just ran on and on as long as you delivered clean water to it.
You had some memories of OCHA line.
Oh, yes.
The railroad.
When the Hojack got its name, I believe, as I always remember, from the hobos that used to ride the rails or ride on the freight cars for free. And if you wanted help during apple picking or when you need others, you would go down there and stand by the railroad when a freight train would go by, holler Hojack, and maybe one of those bows would get off and you could bring him home to work. Mostly here, our help would be during apple picking, what we called hobos. just men without a home evidently, that walked the roads most of their time, and would stop and do your work. But there, and those hobos, as I remember it, had a camp back in the woods near the tracks there, where they would stay overnight or like that.
Did you or your parents ever take seasonal workers into your home to live?
Yes, we always had seasonal workers. There'd be somebody would come in the spring and stay here through the summer, and mother would board them. They'd live up in the back chamber. Our house is divided into two parts, and there was no way of getting from the front part to the back part without going up or down stairs. So Dad would hire a man with a wife. She would help Mother. Well, Margaret's trouble. Is that? Well, the men would help. The wife would help Mother, and the men would work on the farm. Then during apple picking time, we would get some of these other men. I remember one time we had 4 men that came up every year from Pennsylvania. They were miners. They came up here to pick apples, and at that time they would talk about their work in the mines. And I never could, and I don't yet, see how people enjoy working underground as much as these people did. But to them, it was their life. They thought more of working underground, and I would think of working up on the straw stack. And one of our things that happened in our life fairly recently, 10 years ago, Mrs. Harding had a very severe stroke while she was shopping in Rochester. And the stroke paralyzed her right side, and she has been in a wheelchair ever since. But thank goodness her health and her spirits have kept up very good. We've had a very good life together ever since that happened, and right now she's still with us with good health, and I say that was 10 years ago.
Yes. Do the doctors call on you at home?
In those days, yes, the doctors did call. I remember one doctor especially, I think he was the doctor that delivered me, a Dr. Frank Latin from Gaines. And I used to almost try to get ill, so Mother would call him up. But Frank Latin was very famous as a collector of birds' eggs.
Oh, yes.
And I used to do some of that myself. And if I could get Frank Latin up here and talk about birds' eggs, as I understand at that time, he had representatives or people that he knew and corresponded with quite around the world that would send him birds' eggs. And he was supposed to have quite a famous collection of it, those eggs. At that time, too, there was quite a migration of our people to Wayne County to buy fruit farms. And Frank Latin was invested in that project. He had a farm in Wayne County, as I remember.
Well, speaking of going to Wayne County, you and your wife have taken a number of trips and vacation. You were telling about one in California?
Yes, we used to go to, when we could, we went to Florida for a little while every winter. And one winter we took a trip to Baja, California. That is the very tip of the peninsula that borders Mexico. And down there we were housed in a very good motel. There wasn't a house or a town within 15 miles, but it was a beautiful place. In fact, down there the sky used to look bluer than it does here. Maybe because there was nothing around to produce any smog. But good fishing. I caught a 100-pound fish one time, as well as a lot of smaller fish, and any kind of game you wanted to play was available. Tennis, golf, shuffleboard, and all our food was flown in. We were kind of unique there because we had landed by air in La Paz, and the chauffeur that we hired to show us around La Paz talked us into going down to Baja, the tip of it, by car, which was about 50 miles. And that was going through very interesting country, desert country, a lot of cactus. The cows, I remember the cows that come out of that country, the ground didn't look like it would support a mouse. But the cows look pretty good shape.
Cows?
The cows.
Were they dairy cattle?
No, just plain cows. Any kind of animal. Cattle, I should say.
Yes.
I was very sorry they didn't have to be able to ship any out while I was there, because I understand the boat would come in. There was a corral near where we stayed. They would run these cattle into a corral, swim them out to the boat, lasso them, and draw them up by rope onto the boat. I would have liked to have seen that done.
Yes.
Yeah. And then we flew to Los Angeles, and came home by train. And in that time, the train had an observation booth on top, and you'd go up there, and it was a very, very pleasant trip. In fact, now, if I was going somewhere and had the time, I would go by train, because that was the most pleasant ride, looking the country. Sometimes you'd see both ends of the train at the same time, going through the mountains and
Yes.
crossing the country was very, very pleasant.
Yes. Well, Mr. Harding, thank you very much for this interview.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.